The silence wasn't just quiet, it was heavy, like the air had been suddenly sucked out of the dining room, leaving us all gasping in a vacuum. My Aunt Linda, usually the loudest person in any zip code, was frozen with her fork halfway to her mouth, her eyes darting between us with a confused, tight smile that was beginning to crack. But I wasn't looking at her, I was looking at Mark. Mark, my cousin, the Navy SEAL who supposedly ate danger for breakfast, was staring at me across the floral centerpiece like I was a ghost he had been running from for years. His knuckles were white where he gripped the mahogany table edge, and for the first time in his life I saw genuine, unmasked fear in his eyes. His voice, usually a confident boom that commanded the room, came out as a trembling whisper that cut through the tension like a knife. You are Spectre 13? I didn't say a word to defend myself or explain. I just held his terrified gaze, took a slow, deliberate sip of my wine, and nodded once. It was almost funny, in a dark, twisted sort of way. 10 minutes ago, my Aunt Linda was laughing at my cute little government job, making jokes about how I probably got paper cuts while her son got medals. She didn't know that while her son pulls the trigger, I'm the one who tells him where to aim, and more importantly, when to stop. She didn't know that in the world beyond this dining room, I outrank him in ways that don't have insignias. To understand how we got to this deafening silence, we have to go back to the appetizers, before the truth shattered her carefully constructed reality. We had arrived at the house 3 hours earlier for Thanksgiving, and as usual, the place looked less like a family home and more like a museum dedicated to Mark's glory. Every wall was plastered with framed photos of him, Mark in buds, Mark in dress blues, Mark holding a rifle in some desert I wasn't allowed to name. There wasn't a single picture of me, of course. I walked past the shrine in the hallway, feeling that familiar cold weight settle in my chest. I had spent a decade building a career that saved lives, maneuvering assets that cost more than this entire neighborhood, but in this house, if you didn't wear a uniform, you didn't matter. I was just the invisible civilian, the background noise to Mark's grand symphony. The trouble started when Aunt Linda, a woman whose entire personality was constructed around her son's rank, decided to introduce me to a neighbor near the buffet table. She draped an arm around my shoulder, her grip tight and condescending, like she was presenting a disappointment she was trying to make the best of. "And this is our little Maya," she announced, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "She pushes paper at the Pentagon. It's logistics, right, honey? Ordering MREs and making sure the toilet paper forms are signed?" I felt my jaw tighten, grinding my teeth together. I had heard versions of this joke for years. The internal tally of her insults was getting too long to ignore, and the ledger was demanding to be balanced. "Actually, Aunt Linda," I said, keeping my voice level and polite, trying to offer her an off-ramp, "I work in intelligence analysis." I thought that might shut her up, or at least bore her into silence, but she just threw her head back and laughed, a sharp, performative sound that drew the whole room's attention. "Oh, listen to her. Like spy stuff? Please, Maya. Mark is out there risking his life in the sand, sweating in 80 pounds of gear, and you're sitting in air conditioning typing emails." She leaned in, her eyes cold and dismissive, stripping away any pretense of kindness. "Let's not pretend it's the same sport, honey." She wanted to compare us. She wanted to prove that her son was the hero and I was the footnote. She had no idea she was forcing a comparison between the sword and the hand that wields it. The dinner table was a theater, and my Aunt Linda was the director, the lead actress, and the only critic that mattered. She held court with a turkey leg in one hand and a glass of Chardonnay in the other, weaving an epic saga about Mark's bravery that seemed to grow more elaborate with every retelling. Mark, for his part, looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. He kept shifting in his dress blues, picking at a dinner roll, his eyes fixed on the tablecloth as if searching for an escape route. But Linda didn't notice his discomfort, or perhaps she just didn't care, because his discomfort was a small price to pay for her glory. She went on about her boy facing down danger, painting him as a solitary warrior, holding back the tides of chaos while the rest of us slept soundly in our beds. Then, inevitably, the spotlight turned to me, not to shine, but to cast a shadow that would make Mark look even brighter. Linda's voice dropped an octave, shifting from heroic adoration to a cloying, suffocating pity that felt worse than an insult. "And then there's Maya," she sighed, gesturing vaguely in my direction, with a sympathetic tilt of her head that made my stomach turn. Living all alone in that tiny apartment in D.C., working those long, dreary hours. It must be so exhausting, honey. She looked around the table, inviting everyone to join in her performative concern. Probably just filing expense reports and staring at spreadsheets all day, right? It's important work, I'm sure, in its own way. Someone has to keep the lights on for the real heroes. I took a slow sip of water, letting the condensation on the glass cool my fingertips, while my mind flashed back to exactly where I was 48 hours ago. There were no spreadsheets, and there certainly wasn't any sunlight to file papers by. I was sitting in a skiff, a sensitive compartmented information facility, buried 3 floors, beneath the earth, bathed in the sterile humming blue light of a command terminal. I wasn't Maya down there. I didn't have a tiny apartment or a pitying aunt. I was the senior targeter for a joint task force, and the headset pressing against my ear was my direct line to a world of violence that Linda couldn't even conceptualize. On the screen in front of me, 12 men were moving through the grainy monochrome of a thermal satellite. Feed, 12 living, breathing operators thousands of miles away, who moved only when I told them to move. My voice was the only thing anchoring them to the bigger picture, the God's eye view, that separated a successful mission from a catastrophic international incident. I watched a heat signature bloom in the north quadrant of their target compound. A soft white glow against the gray background that shouldn't have been there. It was small, too small for a combatant, too erratic for a sentry. Alpha 1, this is Spectre, I said, my voice flat, stripped of all hesitation and humanity. Negative on entry. Hold position. The team leader on the ground, a man who could probably snap me in half in person, froze instantly at my command. I'm seeing a thermal anomaly in the breach point, I continued, my eyes scanning the data stream cascading down my secondary monitor. Heat signature confirms non-combatants in the north quadrant, likely civilian, abort. I repeat, abort run. There was no debate, no pushback, no but we're close. The men on the ground didn't argue with Spectre. If I said no, the mission stopped dead. If I said engage, buildings crumbled. I wasn't a soldier, I was the heavy hand of fate hovering over the battlefield. Snap back to the dinner table. Aunt Linda was refilling her wine, her face flushed with the self-righteousness of a woman who has never had to weigh the value of a human life against a mission objective. It must be nice though, she said, looking right at me with a sharp, patronizing smile. To have a job where you don't have to make hard decisions, where everything is safe and predictable. Mark has to make split-second choices that change lives. She paused for effect, letting the weight of her son's burden hang in the air between us. You just have to decide whether to use a stapler or a paperclip. The anger flared in my chest, hot and sudden, but I forced it down, burying it under years of practice. I thought about the drone strike I had called off last week with 2 seconds on the clock. The sweat, pooling at the base of my spine as I made the call that saved a family but let a target escape. I thought about the sheer crushing weight of holding absolute authority, the kind that doesn't get medals or parades but ensures there's a world left to celebrate in. Linda saw a quiet niece who needed to be managed. She didn't see the person who decided who lived and who died while she was browsing for turkey recipes. I sat there chewing dry turkey, listening to her explain courage to me. I wanted to tell her that courage isn't just kicking down a door. Sometimes, courage is the discipline to keep it closed. The pumpkin pie hit the table, but Aunt Linda wasn't interested in dessert. She was hungry for a confrontation. By now, the 3rd glass of Chardonnay had stripped away her social filters, leaving only a raw, jagged need to assert dominance over the dinner conversation. She turned to Mark, her voice loud and slurring slightly, asking him about his clearance level again, stroking his ego like a pet. Then she swiveled her gaze to me, her eyes narrowed and predatory, ready to dissect whatever dignity I had left. Mark has top secret, Maya. That's the big leagues, the real deal. What do you have? Confidential? Secret? Is it even classified, or do they just tell you not to post about it on Facebook? I felt the familiar burn of humiliation, the kind that had been etched into my bones since childhood. The feeling of being the perpetual runner-up in a race I never asked to enter. I tried to deflect, keeping my voice soft, the way you speak to a child holding a sharp object. It's different compartments, Aunt Linda, I said, pushing a piece of crust around my plate, refusing to take the bait. Clearance isn't a ladder you climb linearly, it's about access to specific silos. It doesn't work the way you think it does. But nuance was lost on her. She didn't want an explanation, she wanted a scoreboard where her son was winning and I was losing. Mark, to his credit, looked like he wanted to vanish, muttering something about a potential deployment near the Horn of Africa just to change the subject. That was when I slipped up, my professional reflexes overriding my civilian mask. "The Horn is cold right now, Mark," I said, the words coming out sharp and precise before I could soften them. "Asset denial protocols are still in effect there. You wouldn't be routed through that zone unless the theater command changed in the last hour." Mark stopped chewing. His head snapped up, his eyes locking onto mine with a sudden, intense focus. He heard it. The specific cadence, the casually dropped intel that shouldn't be known by a logistics clerk. He sensed a peer. Linda didn't catch the look that passed between us, she only heard me, correcting her golden boy, and that was a sin she couldn't forgive. She slammed her wine glass down, sloshing liquid onto the lace tablecloth. "Don't get snippy with him, Maya," she spat, her face flushing an angry red. "Admit it, you're just jealous. You're basically a secretary for the real heroes. You file papers while he saves the world. You're an office girl, honey. Stop pretending you're anything else." The insults hung in the air, gross and heavy, but for the first time all night they didn't sting. I looked at Mark. I saw the embarrassment on his face, but beneath that, I saw curiosity, a question forming behind his eyes. I realized then that I couldn't let him leave thinking I was nothing. I didn't care about proving Linda wrong, she was too far gone to ever really see me. But I needed Mark to know who was sitting across from him. I needed to balance the ledger, not for the family, but for the mission. She asked for the truth. But the thing about the truth in my line of work? It's usually classified. And when it comes out, it tends to do damage. Linda laughed, and it was the sound of a victory lap she hadn't earned, echoing across the china and the half-eaten pumpkin pie. She leaned forward, the wine glass tilting dangerously in her hand, her face flushed with the satisfaction of having finally put me in my place. "So, you're basically an office girl, right?" she asked, her voice carrying that distinct, sharp edge of dismissal she had honed over 20 years of holidays. "Just admit it so we can move on." It wasn't just a request, it was a demand for submission. She wanted me to verbally sign the ledger she had kept, since I was a child, confirming that I was boring, safe, and ultimately irrelevant compared to her warrior son. I looked at the condensation on my water glass, feeling a strange, cold, calm wash over me, the same icy detachment I felt when a mission clock started ticking down. I set down my glass, the crystal making a soft clink against the wood that felt louder than a gavel strike. "I don't file papers, Aunt Linda," I said, my voice steady, stripped of the apologetic tone I'd used to survive this family for 2 decades. "I handle covert operations. I specialize in high-value target acquisition and asset denial." The table went quiet for a heartbeat, but only because they were processing the sheer audacity of my claim. Linda rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might get stuck, letting out a scoff that was half laugh, half sneer. "Oh please," she said, waving a manicured hand as if swatting away a fly. "You watch too many movies, Maya. What's your little alias then? Agent 99? Do you have a shoe phone tucked under your napkin?" She looked around the table, inviting everyone to join in the mockery, waiting for the chorus of laughter to drown me out one last time. I didn't look at her. I locked eyes with Mark. I needed him to hear this. I needed the operator in him to wake up and recognize the threat assessment sitting directly across from him. I spoke clearly, ensuring every syllable was crisp. "My call sign is Spectre 13. I work out of the NGA, Special Activities Division." Mark stopped breathing. I watched the color drain from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost in his dress blues. He knew that name. In his world, the world of dust and blood and encrypted radio static, Spectre wasn't just a call sign, it was the voice of God. Spectre 13 is legendary for a specific extraction operation. He looked at me, really looked at me, and for the first time, he didn't see his cousin, he saw the entity that cleared his corners from space. Linda, oblivious as only a civilian could be, started to giggle again, ready to tear apart my fantasy. She opened her mouth to make another joke about my active imagination. Mark's hand hit the table with a violence that made the silverware jump. "Mom, stop." The room froze instantly. Mark wasn't looking at his mother with patience anymore. He was looking at her with the panicked urgency of a soldier trying to stop a civilian from walking into a live minefield. He turned to her, his voice shaking, not with anger, but with reverence. "Spectre 13 isn't a secretary, Mom," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. Desperate to correct the record before she said something she couldn't take back. "She's Overwatch. Do you know what that means? When my team is on the ground, blindly kicking doors, she is the voice in my ear telling me what's behind them." He looked back at me, and instinctively, his posture straightened. He was sitting at attention in his own dining room. "If she gives a red light, the Admiral himself doesn't override her," he continued, his voice dropping to a harsh, awestruck whisper. "She doesn't work for me, Mom. In the field, I work for her." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that follows an explosion, where your ears ring, and the dust settles on the ruins of what used to be a conversation. Linda looked from her son, her hero, her golden boy, to me, the office girl. I saw the gears grinding in her head, the painful screeching halt of her worldview fracturing into a million pieces as she realized the hierarchy she worshipped had just been inverted. The hierarchy of the dinner table had collapsed. My aunt thought she was the queen mother of a warrior prince. She just found out she was insulting his commanding officer. The dinner party didn't end so much as it disintegrated, falling apart, under the weight of a truth that no one at the table knew how to digest. We finished the meal in a stilted, awkward haze, the kind where everyone is suddenly very interested in the pattern of the tablecloth or the weather forecast for next week. Once the last fork was set down, the exodus from the dining room was immediate, like a tactical retreat from a losing battle. Aunt Linda retreated to the kitchen, and within seconds, the aggressive clatter of pots and pans began to echo through the house, a frantic, noisy attempt to scrub away the humiliation of the last hour. She was washing dishes like she was trying to sandblast the memory of my voice out of her head, refusing to make eye contact with me as she moved with jerky, furious motions. I watched her back for a moment, feeling a strange, hollow sort of pity mixed with the satisfaction of finally being seen, even if she didn't like what she saw. I slipped out the back sliding glass door, needing the bite of the November air to clear the smell of roast turkey and resentment from my lungs. I leaned against the railing of the deck, looking out into the dark backyard where Mark and I used to play tag before life sorted us into heroes and logistics clerks. The silence out here was real, not the suffocating tension of the dining room, and I closed my eyes, letting the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly bleed out of my system. The door slid open behind me, the sound heavy on the track, and I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Mark stepped out, the floorboards creaking under his boots, holding 2 sweating bottles of beer like peace offerings in the cold night. He handed one to me without a word, and we stood there for a long moment, watching the steam of our breath rise into the darkness. He wasn't standing like the golden child anymore, chest puffed out for his mother's adoration. He was standing like a tired operator who had just realized he was in the presence of a superior officer. He took a long pull from his bottle, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and finally broke the silence, his voice rougher than usual. "The Yemen extraction in 23, he started, staring straight ahead at the tree line. "The one in the Abyan Governorate. We were pinned down in that valley, taking heavy fire from the ridge, and our extract helo waved off." I nodded, the memory surfacing instantly, not as a story but as a grid of coordinates and fuel gauges on my monitors 3,000 miles away. "You guys were running low on fuel and ammo," I said quietly, looking into the amber liquid in my bottle. "And the cloud cover was too thick for the drones to get a clean visual. I rerouted an AC-130 gunship that was on patrol 2 sectors over. The pilot didn't want to break his flight path, but I used a Title 50 override to force the diversion." I looked at him then, remembering the static-filled panic in the radio traffic that night. "I had them lay down a suppression corridor so you could move to the secondary LZ. It was the only play we had left." Mark shook his head slowly, a laugh escaping him that sounded like pure disbelief. "We bought drinks for Spectre that night when we got back to base," he said, turning to look at me with a bewildered grin. "The whole team toasted the ghost in the machine who saved our asses. I didn't know I owed the beer to my cousin." He looked down at his boots, the bravado completely gone, replaced by a sober, grounded respect. "Mom, she doesn't get it," he said, gesturing vaguely back toward the kitchen where the aggressive dishwashing was still audible. "She thinks war is like the movies, all shine and medals. She doesn't understand that the scariest thing on the battlefield isn't the guy with the gun. It's the person on the radio who decides when the sky falls." "She never will get it, Mark," I said, and for the first time in my life, the thought didn't sting. "She needs the story where you're the hero and I'm the help. It's the only way her world makes sense." I realized then that I had been bringing my ledger to her for years, hoping she would finally tally up my worth and pay out the respect I was owed, but her currency was counterfeit. I took a sip of the beer, feeling the cold glass numb my fingers, and made a decision that settled into my chest like a cornerstone. I wasn't coming back for Christmas. I wasn't coming back for Easter. I was done auditing a bank that had been bankrupt since I was born. Mark seemed to understand the unspoken boundary I was drawing. He didn't ask me to forgive her, and he didn't try to broker a peace treaty that we both knew would fail. "Well," he said, clinking his bottle against mine, a sharp, clear sound in the night. Spectre 13. Good to finally put a face to the voice. We finished our drinks in a companionable silence, two professionals acknowledging the job, leaving the family drama to the people who needed it to survive. When I left that night, I walked out the front door without saying goodbye to Linda, and the door clicking shut behind me felt less like an exit and more like a release. 6 months later, the world looked very different. I was standing in a briefing room at the Pentagon, the lighting bright and clinical. Listening to the hum of servers rather than the clatter of silverware, I had been promoted to Deputy Chief of Operations, a role that put me in charge of the entire regional theater, my nameplate on the heavy oak door finally reflecting the weight of the decisions I made. I was no longer the invisible child waiting for crumbs of attention. I was the architect of the table. My phone buzzed on the polished conference table, lighting up with a notification during a lull in the briefing. I glanced down and saw a text from a number I had saved only recently. It was a picture of a fresh pint of beer sitting on a bar somewhere dusty and far away. The caption underneath was simple, "Happy birthday, Spectre. Rounds are on me tonight." A small, genuine smile touched my lips, not the polite, forced smile I wore at family gatherings, but a real one. I tapped the screen off, picked up my tablet, and turned back to the room full of officers waiting for my command. My aunt wanted to know what I was worth. In the end, she couldn't afford the answer. Real power isn't loud, and it doesn't need a seat at the head of the table. It just needs to be ready when the call comes. If you've ever been underestimated by the people who should know you best, let me know in the comments. You're in good company here.